is his very last book he published, which is Vegetable Mold and Earthworms. And what's intriguing about this book, it was published in 1881, just a year before his death, but it is actually his first love, for several reasons. Firstly, when he returned from the voyage of the Beagle, he'd been thinking about his cousin young Emma Wedgwood, who he later married, and therefore in his courting days, he was round at his uncle's house. Emma was his first cousin, which is a little peculiar, but he was round at his uncle's house in Shropshire, and it was Josiah Wedgwood who pointed out to Charles Darwin. He said, it's very interesting, this field here, I've been throwing ash and cinders on this field for about a year ago. We covered this field in ash, and it's all disappeared. And he said, if you take a spade, and I'll show you, took him out into the field, dug with a shovel, and could show him that the ash layer was now ½ an inch to an inch down in the soil. He said, it's interesting, why has that disappeared in there? And of course, Charles Darwin had, during his voyage on the Beagle, had a remarkable insight into how the world worked. Not that it had been created, that all species were immutable, but that the whole world acted in a very dynamic manner and all species on it. And of course, logically, he quickly saw that this was due to earthworms throwing up their little casts on top of the soil and burying things. And he spent the next 44 years working on this manuscript every time he was cultivating plants. And again, when we look back at Charles Darwin's publications, we find that of his sort of 14 books, 12 of them are about plants, they're botanical studies. And growing his little potted plants and so on, he was always watching the way earthworms behaved. He spent his many, many years feeding earthworms. He would cut up leaves, even cut up bits of paper. And this is something any of us can retry. If you cut paper into little triangles, now we think worms aren't very bright, and yet there's a whole chapter on worms' intelligence in here. And a worm can quickly ascertain it. It can feel that little triangle of paper in the dark, and it works out where the corner, the point is. And it pulls that bit of paper, or any leaves, their pointy end first, down into their burrow. Now, Charles Darwin was convinced that these leaves, more than anything else, were there to block the cold air out for the worm. But amongst all these other observations is, when you have a thin soil on top of a brightly coloured rock, say it's chalk or red sandstone, you might have 3 or 4 inches of soil. Well, the interesting thing is the worm is throwing up casts of pure black organic soil. So the worm is clearly moving around in that surface layer. And he calculated that worms, on average, in a bit of arable land, a bit of grassland, will produce something like 8 pounds per acre. I'm going to use acres and pounds, just judging by the audience here, rather than hectares and square meterage. 8 pounds per square yard. That's 20 tons per acre of soil being turned over every single year. Essentially, 1/10 of the topsoil is turned over by worms every year. It is a remarkable figure. And Darwin was also intrigued at how many earthworms are there in an acre of land. And he calculated that there was between 250,000 and 1 million worms. That's about 2 tons, 1.5 to 2 tons of worm meat per acre, which any of you involved in farming will know that's about the maximum number of cattle you can keep on an acre of productive grassland. So 2 cows will be the equivalent weight, if you like, on an acre of land as the worms hiding underneath the grass. I suppose what we can do is move on from Darwin and say, what have we learnt in the intervening 140 years? The answer is frighteningly little, frighteningly little. What Darwin had done was take a topic that was quite unknown when he first published a little paper about the action of worms on vegetable mold. This observation that worms were pulling leaves down into the soil was something that had really been overlooked by most scientists. And even at the time of his first little paper on the action of worms, a lot of scientists were incredulous. They said, we can't quite believe that an ignorant little animal could be moving so much soil, could be so involved. Now today we realize that the Earth runs purely on fusion energy. if you ask people, you know, how does energy arise? Where do we get our energy on the Earth? They will talk about all sorts of spurious things. They'll say, well, it's the wind and the tide, nuclear energy, petrol, fuel, we're burning gas. None of these are correct. We run on a fusion reactor, just one gigantic fusion reactor, 80 million miles away. The center of the sun is where all our energy comes from. And by a remarkable trick of photosynthesis, all of that energy is transferred, that hits the Earth, is transferred to energy on this globe. Some goes into heating the atmosphere, which creates wind, which we can gather with wind energy, tidal energy, wave energy. But the bulk of it goes into this photosynthetic process. And whilst a lot of it is out in the oceans, all the little algae in the oceans, that on land is dependent solely upon soil. So soil is the vital go-between between this fusion reactor 80 million miles away and all the food that we can grow off the soil. Human beings still live on 95% of their agricultural produce. Only about 5% comes from wild harvested fish from the oceans and the rivers and the seas. So that energy is clearly entirely dependent upon the existence of soil. And I want to tell you about another extraordinary character who you might not know the name of, but actually you've been following his philosophy, I hope, for much of your lives. Patrick Geddes. Patrick Geddes was the professor of botany up in Dundee University at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And Patrick Geddes coined a remarkable term, a terminology which most of us will live by, which is to act locally and think globally. It is an extraordinary concept, if you like, and it's the basis of the entire green movement, this understanding that the ecology of the world is more important to us than the economics of this world. So Patrick Geddes said, the world is like a vast leaf colony, growing and producing a leaf-derived soil. So all of the soil is derived from the leaves of plants that rot down to make it. And indeed, going back through the history of life on Earth, we can see this extraordinary moment when the first plants appear. The first plants that they are found as fossils in the Sleeve Bloom Mountains. About 300 million years ago, 250 million years ago, the very first tiny plants were getting out of the oceans. And up until that moment, there was no soil on the Earth. All of life really existed in the oceans, the seas. And it was at that moment when soils began to form that land plants invaded the surface of the land and built soil. So all of our soils are built from plants. And this is a very important concept because we tend to think, or a vast majority of people, hopefully none in this room, think of the soil as inanimate. But rocks and soil are parts of the inanimate world around us. Life is shown by animals. In fact, many people have difficulties believing that plants are alive, that they're animate. And this is a fundamental sort of difference how we view the world. Animal, mineral, and vegetable is a way that mentally we divide things up. And yet all three of these things, soil, animals, and plant life, are very much alive. And going back to Darwin's observations on worms, we know a lot more today. As Klaus said, the quantity of microorganisms in the form of little springtails, mites, and nematodes living on the soil is vast. It's nowhere near the quantity of earthworms, but the bacteria living in soil are equivalent to the weight of cattle and worms. So on an acre of land, we've got something like 2 tons of bacteria hiding away in all of that soil in our view. That bacteria numbers, again, as Klaus pointed out, a teaspoon of soil can contain anywhere between 100 and 1 billion bacterial cells. On top of that, vast numbers of viruses. We have no idea what most of them are. Any soil scientists who've been examining this, what they do is they look at the entire DNA, you extract all the DNA from a little gram of soil, and then you work out how many operational taxonomic units, OTUs, which is essentially saying how many genomes are here in this gram of soil. And the answer is between 10 and 50,000 different species of bacteria, viruses, and fungi are living in a gram. So a teaspoon is about 5 grams of soil. So in that single gram, up to 50,000 species of bacteria and fungi. These things are part of an animate soil. One of the remarkable things is if you start cultivating a plot of land, so something might have been grassland for 100 years, it's got a population of 1 million worms an acre. As soon as you start to cultivate it, that earthworm population plummets to about 1/100th. So we're talking from a good historic patch of grassland that has not been interfered with artificial fertilizers and so on. You're talking of over 1,000 worms per square yard, up to 2,000 worms. And that will drop to 5 to 10 worms per square yard in a piece of land that has been permanently under cultivation of a single or a small rotation of crops.